Thank you very much, Professor. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be a part of this project. The subject of this presentation is the relationship between the major criminological schools and the way in which the European Court of Human Rights assesses domestic solutions in criminal law and the execution of penalties. The starting point is the assumption that a debate about punishment is never merely technical. It is always also an axiological debate about what justice is, what the purpose of punishment is, how the offender's responsibility should be understood, and how far the state may go in protecting society. So in this sense, criminal law remains rooted not only in the theory of the state and the law, but also in much broader moral and cultural tradition. In the European legal culture, the idea of just retribution has very deep roots, including religious ones. This is not, of course, a call of simple transplantation of religious norms into modern criminal law, but rather the belief that evil should be met with a just response has for centuries helped shape the European legal imagination. Similarly, the idea of mercy, forgiveness, and giving a person another chance is also an important part of Christian ethics, which makes it possible to see that a more corrective, rehabilitative understanding of punishment may likewise find some support in Christian axiology. In the next part, I would like to shortly present three major criminological schools and then show how their values translate into criminal policies of European states. So the first one is a classical school. Its roots are to be found in Enlightenment, liberal, and rationalist thought. And its leading figures include, above all, Cesare Beccaria, Jeremy Bentham. This school rests on the conviction that the human being is a rational agent capable of making decisions and bearing responsibility for his or her acts. If that is so, punishment must be foreseeable, legal, and proportionate, and its purpose is both just retribution and deterrence. The classical school is therefore deeply linked to guarantees and limitations on power. It limits arbitrariness, demands clarity of law, and opposes excessive discretion on the part of state authorities. At the same time, it assumes that punishment is morally justified because it responds to culpable violation of a norm. Punishment here is not merely an instrument of social management, it is also an expression of justice. The second school is a positivist school. Its development is connected with the 19th century turn toward the scientific study of the cases of the causes of the crime, with a growing interest in biological, psychological, and social determinants of the offender's behavior. In this approach, the center of gravity shifts from the act itself to the person of the offender. Punishment ceases to be understood exclusively as a retribution. It becomes an instrument of social protection, treatment, correction, and prevention. From this axiological perspective, it's worth noting that positivism does not have to lead only to cold technicism. It can also be read as more personalist way, as the conviction that a person who has committed a wrong need to be definitely condemned forever. In this sense, positivist openness to the offender's improvement and giving him another chance to, can partly be connected to the Christian idea of conversion, forgiveness, and possibility of moral transformation. But there is a third school, radical one, and I would like to make an important point of reference. It grows from critique of structures of power, social inequality, and the way in which the state defines crime and distributes repression. For this current, the crucial question is not only why does the individual committed an offense, but also who creates the criminal law, whose interests does it protect, and against whom it's more often enforced. Radical criminology therefore shifts attention from individual guilt to structural inequality, and from moral assessment to the act, to an analysis of relations of power and domination. And this does not, of course, mean that radical criminology denies the existence of real offenses or the need to protect legal goods. However, criminal policy may serve not only justice, but also as a preservation of some social arrangements. And if we compare these three schools with the practice of European states, we quickly see that no state today implements a single school in a pure form. Contemporary criminal justice systems are composite. They combine elements of retribution, deterrence, rehabilitation, and social protection. Even some dominant emphasizes that still might be identified. In the part of Central and Eastern Europe, the axiological language of security, order, and just retribution remains more visible. But in the Nordic states, greater emphasis is often placed on social reintegration, limiting the use of prison isolation and adopting a more pragmatic and inclusive model of sentence enforcement. In some Western European states, one finds mixed solution in which traditional functions of punishment coexist with increasingly strong humanitarian and rehabilitative standard. This diversity is not accidental because it results from different constitutional traditions, historical experiences, views of the role of the state, as well as cultural and religious differences. For that reason, criminal policy cannot be viewed solely as a matter of efficiency. It's also an expression of collective identity and of an adopted hierarchy of the values. So for some societies, the imperative of just retribution resonates more strongly. For others, the possibility of reforming the offender carries a greater weight. If we look at the European Court of Human Rights against that background, I would like to come to the principal question. Does the case law of the European Court of Human Rights truly leaves states with broad space to maintain different models of criminal policy? My answer is skeptical because formally the court refers to the conception of the margin of appreciation, but in practice, in many criminal and penitentiary cases, it increasingly promotes a particular vision of punishment, a humanitarian and rehabilitative vision in which retribution and deterrence lose their independent weight. So this is most clearly visible in cases concerning long-term and life imprisonment. In the case Winter and others versus United Kingdom, the court held that the life sentence must be reducibly both de jure and de facto, and that the prisoner must have a real prospect of review of his situation. In other words, even where a state considers certain offenses to deserve the harshest possible response, it may not construct the penalty in a way that definitely closes off the possibility of release. Behind that position stands a strong conviction that human being is not be entirely deprived of hope, and the rehabilitation function of punishment must remain present even in relation to the gravest offenders. The subsequent case law, especially Murray versus Netherlands, Hutchinson versus United Kingdom, did not reject that logic, but refined it. The court accepted the continued existence of very severe penalties, but only on condition that there is a real mechanism for their review. This means that states retain only an apparent freedom as to the statutory design of sanctions, because they may not reject the underlying assumption that every life sentence should leave open some path toward an assessment of prisoners' progress. From the perspective of states that prefer a classical understanding of retribution and lasting incapacitation of the most dangerous offenders, and this is already a far-reaching axiological intervention. Also, we have the issue of life imprisonment without a real possibility of parole or release. This is where the sharpest clash between the classical school and positivist rehabilitative approach becomes visible. From a classical perspective, it may be argued that exceptionally grave crimes justify lasting and sometimes final isolation of the offender as an element of just retribution and protection of the community. It, however, adapts perspective that now dominates in Strasbourg. Even the gravest offender cannot be deprived of legal hope for a future review of the sentence. Second issue is the proportionality of punishment. Proportionality itself has classical roots and is one of the foundations of the rule of law. The problem is that in contemporary human rights case law, proportionality increasingly becomes a tool for intensive review of the axiological choices made by the legislature. The question is no longer only whether a penalty is arbitrary, but increasingly also whether it fits within a particular vision of humane criminal law. As a result, the court does not merely guard the outer limits of legality, as to some extent it also co-shapes the substance of permissible criminal policy. There is also the third issue, that is the relationship between convention standards and the axiological sovereignty of the states. So European states are not identical. They do not share the same history, the same social structure, or the same criminal law traditions. They also differ in how they understand the balance between security, retribution, mercy, and rehabilitation. If that is so, then the question of the scope of the court's intervention is not a secondary one. It's a question of who in Europe has the final word on the meaning of punishment, the domestic democratic legislature or international court interpreting the convention in an evolutive manner. This brings me to the issue of margin of appreciation. In theory, this doctrine is meant to protect pluralism and to allow states to preserve their distinctiveness where there is no full European consensus, or where the issue is deeply rooted in national tradition. In practice, however, one may gain the impression that in criminal matters, its significance is limited by the court's growing readiness to formulate uniform substantive standards, especially where it invokes dignity, humanitarianism, and prohibition of inhuman treatment. The problem, however, is that in the field of criminal law, and penitentiary policy, the line between protecting human rights and replacing domestic axiological judgment becomes increasingly blurred. Once the court tells a state not only that it may not do, but also what meaning punishment itself must have, it enters deeply into the core of criminal policy. And this is precisely where the question of Europe's pluralism returns. If we truly accept that Europe is a community of many legal traditions, then we must also accept that not all states will attach the same weight to rehabilitation, for example. Some will place stronger emphasis on just retribution, others on the protection of society, and still others on critique of structural inequality. But the convention should therefore set minimal boundaries, but it need not impose one dominant philosophy of punishment. To conclude, I would like to stress out 3 points. First, the debate about punishment is ultimately a debate about the human person and about the political community. About whether retribution, reform of the offender, or critique of structures of domination should stand as at the center. Second, the 3 criminological schools, classical, positivist, and radical, remain useful tools for describing European criminal policies because they reveal their hidden axiological assumptions. And the third, the case law of the European Court of Human Rights is not neutral or arbitral voice in this debate, but participant in it, increasingly promoting a humanitarian and rehabilitative model that narrows the space for national difference. Thank you very much for your attention.